9 months after the counterattack, the Void Scourge returned with focused vengeance. They had rebuilt their breach generators and learned from their losses. This time they did not probe or test defenses. They committed everything to a single overwhelming assault designed to end the war permanently. Every dimensional barrier around Asterlin shattered at the same moment. The sky itself tore open in dozens of places simultaneously. The Scourge poured through in numbers that blocked out the sun. This was not an invasion anymore. This was extinction delivered with absolute certainty. King Therivol stood in the throne room surrounded by his advisors and military commanders. Everyone was shouting suggestions and tactical options. The king raised his hand for silence. Then he gave an order that made the entire room go quiet. He told his mages to activate the Great Ward. The Great Ward was ancient magic built into the foundations of Asterlin itself. It could seal the entire realm away from all dimensional space, a perfect barrier that nothing could penetrate. It would save the kingdom but trap them forever, cut off from every other world and dimension, a cage of their own making that would preserve them in isolation for eternity. The mages moved to begin the activation sequence. Then Kaelin burst into the throne room. Ember barely fit through the massive doors behind her. The dragon's presence filled the space with heat and the smell of smoke. Kaelin shouted for them to wait. She said if they sealed the realm, they would doom every other dimension to the same fate eventually. The Void Scourge would simply move to the next target, then the next, consuming everything until nothing remained in all of dimensional space except empty void. They had to end this threat here and now. King Therivol looked at his daughter with exhaustion and despair written across his face. He asked how they could possibly end this. The projection showed that the Scourge had brought their entire force. Every creature, every ship, every weapon. The Elven realm could not win against those numbers. Claire stepped forward. She looked as tired as everyone else. 3 days of continuous fighting had left her covered in blood and void residue, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. She said they did not need to fight to win. They needed to fight long enough to make victory irrelevant. The king stared at the human, waiting for an explanation. Claire moved to the tactical display and brought up deep space scans. The Scourge had pulled everything through the breaches. That meant they had emptied their forces from everywhere else. Elder Mistral spoke up from where she sat, recovering from magical exhaustion. She said if they could collapse every breach simultaneously, while the Scourge was committed on this side of reality, something unprecedented would happen. The enemy would be cut off from void space, stranded in normal reality and subject to physical laws. They would become mortal. Kaelin finished the thought. And mortal things could be killed. But collapsing that many breaches at once would require an enormous power source. More than any mage could provide. More than any artifact possessed. Ember's voice rumbled through everyone's mind. The dragon had never spoken to anyone except Kaelin before. Now his words reached every person in the throne room. He said it would require a dragon's fire, and a rider willing to burn with him. The room fell into absolute silence. Therivol said no immediately. He refused to even consider it. There had to be another way. Claire's voice shook when she spoke. For the first time since arriving in Asterlin, her iron control cracked. She said they would find a different solution. She had not spent 3 years training Kaelin just to watch her die. Kaelin looked at her father, then at the human who had become her teacher and friend and sister in everything but blood. She said they had both taught her what real strength meant. Strength was not about never being afraid. It was about doing what was necessary even when terror threatened to overwhelm you. Claire grabbed the princess by the arm. She said there had to be another option. Let her go instead. She could pilot one of the gliders. She could carry explosives. She could do something other than just stand there and watch. Kaelin pulled Claire into a fierce embrace. She said the human did not have magic, and this ritual required both magic and dragonfire combined. Besides, someone needed to survive and tell this story. Someone needed to let the universe know what happened here, to tell them that Earth sent someone who changed everything. She turned to Elder Mistral and asked how to perform the ritual. The old mage explained with a voice that trembled. Kaelin listened carefully. She asked questions to make sure she understood every detail. Her voice was calm now, almost peaceful. This was just another tactical problem that needed solving. She walked out onto the grand balcony overlooking the battlefield. Ember knelt beside her, and she climbed onto his back one final time. Her hands found their familiar positions in the places where his scales provided natural grips. She had mounted this dragon thousands of times over 3 years. This would be the last. She admitted to Ember that she was scared, more frightened than she had ever been. The dragon's response filled her mind with warmth and certainty. He said he was scared too, but they were not alone in their fear. They had each other, and that made even death bearable. Evacuation horns sounded across the battlefield. General Aldrich received his orders from the king and pulled all elven forces back to protected positions. The Scourge sensed victory approaching and surged forward eagerly. They concentrated into a massive formation, thinking they had finally broken the realm's defenders. It was exactly what Kaelin needed them to do. She closed her eyes and began channeling power. Every bit of magic she possessed flowed out of her. 3 years of training had refined her abilities to their absolute peak. Ember added his fire, dragon flame that burned hot enough to melt stone and pure enough to touch the fabric of reality itself. Together they became a star of raw energy hovering above the battlefield. Their light was bright enough to be seen from other dimensions. Below them, Claire watched through tears she did not bother hiding. She whispered that the princess was supposed to have more time. She deserved more time. King Theraval stood beside the human. His own tears fell freely. He said his daughter had enough time. Thanks to Claire, she had lived more in 3 years than most people experienced in a lifetime. The power built higher and higher. Kaelin reached out with her magic and touched every dimensional breach simultaneously. It felt like holding lightning in bare hands, like her body was being torn apart and remade from pure agony. But she held on because that was what warriors did. They endured the unbearable for something greater than themselves. She called out to Elder Mistral. The old mage triggered her part of the ritual. The breaches began collapsing. Reality reasserted itself against the void. The Scourge forces suddenly realized what was happening and tried desperately to retreat. But it was too late. The trap had already closed. Kaelin spoke to Ember one last time. She said his name with love and gratitude. The dragon responded that he was with her, always and forever. Until the end and beyond, the princess smiled. She said they would show the Scourge what happened when they pushed a fragile girl too far, when they underestimated someone who refused to stay broken. Then she released everything. The explosion lit up dimensional space. Every breach collapsed at exactly the same moment. The Void Scourge found themselves trapped in Asterlin's reality. Cut off from the void, they became vulnerable to conventional weapons. The elven army swept through over the next 3 days and eliminated the stranded forces completely. Not a single Scourge creature escaped. The threat was ended. Not just pushed back or delayed. Completely and permanently destroyed. But the cost was devastating. Where Kaelin and Ember had been, there was now only ash falling like snow. The particles glittered silver in the sunlight, like the princess's hair had been, like starlight made solid and scattered across the wind. 3 months later, Claire stood in the memorial garden they had built. A statue dominated the space, showing Kaelin and Ember in flight. Frozen in marble at the moment before their sacrifice, the sculptor had captured the determination in the princess's face, the fierce joy in the dragon's eyes. It was beautiful and terrible and inadequate. King Theraval found Claire there. He moved slowly now. The last 3 months had aged him beyond measure. He said Claire's contract was complete. She had fulfilled everything they hired her to do and more. She could stay if she wanted. Help rebuild, train the next generation. Claire shook her head. She said they did not need her anymore. That had always been the point. Make herself obsolete. Besides, she could not stay here and look at this statue every day. It hurt too much to remember. The king said Kaelin had left letters. One of them was for Claire. In it, the princess wrote that the human had taught her strength was not about being unbreakable. It was about knowing you would break and doing it anyway for something that mattered. That evening, the dimensional portal opened to take Claire back to Earth. She looked at the elven realm one final time. They would survive. She had taught them well. Veterans were already training recruits using her methods. The kingdom would endure. The portal closed and Claire returned home. 20 years passed in Earth's time. A dimensional explorer stumbled. Victory proved to be temporary and fragile. The Void Scourge had tested the defenses of Asterlin and found them stronger than expected. Now they adapted their strategy. The attacks became more coordinated and more frequent. They targeted multiple breach points at the same time while probing for weaknesses in the dimensional barriers. What had been catastrophic invasion attempts became a grinding war that consumed resources and lives with steady, relentless pressure. Kaylin barely slept anymore. For 6 months straight, she led rapid response forces from one crisis to the next. Her body moved on instinct and training because conscious thought had become too slow. Ember grew larger and more powerful with each battle. His flames could now collapse minor breaches without any support. But the princess could see exhaustion in her dragon's eyes that mirrored her own bone-deep weariness. Claire pushed herself just as hard. She trained new recruits in human combat tactics while coordinating strategy with General Aldrich. The traditional elven military structure had been forced to adapt to her methods or fail. Some commanders resented taking orders from a human, but results were impossible to argue against. Units trained by Claire survived. Units that clung to old methods died. King Tharival coordinated everything from the capital. He managed dwindling resources and tried to maintain diplomatic relations with neighboring realms. The Void Scourge threatened all of dimensional space, not just Asterlin, but getting other kingdoms to commit forces and supplies proved frustratingly difficult. Everyone wanted to wait and see. Nobody wanted to be the first to fully commit to a war that might be hopeless. It was during a rare moment of calm that Claire found Kaylin standing alone on the palace ramparts. The princess stared at distant stars while Ember lay curled nearby. The dragon had used some magic to shrink himself down to the size of a large dog. His head rested on Kaylin's feet, providing warmth and comfort. Claire said that Kaylin was thinking too loud. She could hear it from inside the palace. The princess smiled tiredly. She said they were losing. Slowly but steadily, they were losing ground. Every breach they sealed resulted in 3 more opening elsewhere. Every victory cost them resources they could not replace. The Void Scourge could maintain this pressure forever. The Elven realm could not. Claire did not offer false comfort. That had never been their relationship. She agreed that wars of attrition favored the side with unlimited resources. They needed to change the fundamental nature of the conflict. Kaylin asked how. They could not attack the source of the scourge. The enemy existed in void space between dimensions. There was no way to reach them there. No way to strike back at their origin point. Claire said that actually there might be a way. She had been consulting with Elder Mistral and the dimensional physicists. The Void Scourge was not really from the void itself. They were using void space as a highway between dimensions. They had to originate somewhere, some stable reality that served as their home base. If the Elven forces could trace a breach back to its source location, they might be able to launch a counterattack. Kaylin turned to stare at the human. She said Claire wanted to invade the Scourge, to go through one of their breaches and attack them in their own dimension. Claire nodded. It was a human concept called strategic bombing. You did not just defend your borders. You made the enemy afraid to attack by proving you could hurt them worse than they hurt you. You took the fight to them and made them pay a price they were unwilling to accept. The princess said that plan was completely insane. They would be sending forces into hostile dimensional space with no support and no retreat. No guarantee they would even survive the transit between realities. Claire grinned. She said yes, which was exactly why the Scourge would never see it coming. They thought the Elven forces were prey. It was time to show them they were dealing with predators. 2 weeks later, a massive Scourge incursion opened a stable breach that Elder Mistral calculated would remain open for nearly an hour. It was exactly the opportunity they needed. Kaylin stood before an assault team of 50 volunteers. These were the best warriors in the realm, veterans of dozens of battles. They rode the fastest dragons and wyverns available. Claire was among them, having refused to be left behind. Ember stood at the center, now grown to his full impressive size, large enough to carry multiple riders if necessary. The princess explained the mission parameters. They would go through the breach and find whatever was generating these constant attacks. Then they would destroy it. Elder Mistral would maintain the breach from their side for exactly 45 minutes. After that, they would be on their own. A young rider named Beth raised her hand. She asked what would happen if they did not make it back in time. Kaylin looked at her team with absolute honesty. She said then they would make their deaths count for something meaningful, but she had not trained with the scariest human in dimensional space for 3 years just to die in some void-touched nightmare realm. They were coming home. Claire made a sound that might have been amusement at being called the scariest human. But she did not contradict the statement. They flew through the breach. The transit was worse than anything they had imagined. Reality twisted around them, trying to tear their bodies apart at the molecular level. Several riders screamed. One wyvern panicked and tried to turn back. It slammed into the dimensional membrane and dissolved into component atoms. The rider died without even time to understand what happened. Then they were through into the Scourge dimension. The realm was a twisted mockery of normal reality. Physics operated on malevolent rules that made no sense. Structures that could not exist stretched in impossible directions. The air itself pressed against them with tangible hostility. Everything here wanted them dead or consumed or both. Claire pointed to what might have been a massive fortress, or might have been a living creature. It was impossible to tell. The structure generated a massive energy signature. That was their target. They dove toward it, and the Scourge forces finally realized something was terribly wrong. This was not prey wandering into their territory. This was an invasion force. The battle that followed was desperate and chaotic beyond description. Scourge creatures poured from the fortress thing in endless waves. Kalen's team fought with everything they had. Claire's tactical coordination kept them alive. Through focused aggression and constant movement, Kalen and Ember broke through defensive lines heading for what Elder Mistral had identified as the breach generator, a massive crystal of solidified void energy. If they could destroy it, the Scourge would lose their ability to attack Asterland for months, maybe longer. A creature larger than anything they had faced rose to stop them. This was a primordial, one of the ancient beings that commanded entire Scourge fleets. It radiated power that made the Devourer from the first battle seem like a minor threat. Kalen shouted to Claire over the communication device. She was going for the generator. She needed 30 seconds with that thing distracted. Claire's voice came back strained but steady. She said 30 seconds was doable. Then she rallied the assault team and concentrated all their fire on the primordial. It was like attacking a mountain with thrown pebbles. But they bought the time Kalen needed. The princess channeled everything she possessed into one final strike. All her magic refined through 3 years of brutal training. All of Ember's fire, the enchanted blade that Claire had commissioned from Earth's finest weaponsmiths. She drove it all into the generator crystal with every bit of strength she had left. The crystal cracked. Then it shattered completely. Claire's voice cut through the chaos. She ordered everyone to retreat immediately. The entire structure was collapsing around them. They fled back toward the breach point. The Scourge dimension literally fell apart as they flew. The primordial realized what had happened and pursued with fury that shook reality itself. Ember was fastest. He broke through the breach first with Kalen on his back. Then Claire and most of the others. A desperate scramble as the breach began collapsing ahead of schedule. Beth's wyvern was too slow. The young rider looked back once. She met Kalen's eyes across dimensional space. Then she smiled and turned her mount around. She drove straight at the pursuing primordial, buying precious seconds with her sacrifice. Her death gave the last few riders time to escape. The breach collapsed. Elder Mistral fell unconscious from the effort of holding it open so long. Of the 50 who entered, only 38 returned, but the generator was destroyed. Attacks on Asterland dropped to a fraction of their previous intensity overnight. The Void Scourge had learned a painful lesson. The Elven realm could strike back, could hurt them, could make them bleed. That night, Kalen held a memorial service for Beth and the 11 others who had not returned. She spoke of their courage and sacrifice, the debt that could never be fully repaid. Her voice was steady, but her hands shook. Claire found the princess afterward standing alone. Tears finally fell now that there was time and privacy for them. Kalen whispered that she had gotten those people killed. They had followed her orders and died because of decisions she made. Claire's response was firm but not unkind. She said no. Kalen had led warriors into a battle they volunteered for, knowing the stakes. They died. 2.5 years passed in a blur of constant training and preparation. Kalen no longer resembled the fragile princess who had once hidden in silk bedrooms. She stood before the War Council wearing practical armor that Claire had designed specifically for her. The armor was light enough to allow full movement, but reinforced at all critical points. It bore the silver insignia of the royal house, but nothing else decorative or unnecessary. Ember lounged behind her chair. The dragon had grown to the size of a small house. His copper and gold scales gleamed under the magical lights of the council chamber. When he breathed, the air shimmered with heat. He was fully mature now, and bonded so deeply to Kaelin that they could communicate without words. Claire stood to the right of the princess. She wore a formal uniform but had modified it to be actually useful in combat. The court had long since learned not to comment on the human's disregard for proper appearance. She had earned too much respect through results to criticize over clothing. General Aldrich commanded the elven armies. He was ancient by human standards and had fought in wars that were old when Claire's grandparents were born. He stood at the tactical display showing the dimensional barriers that protected their realm. Red warning indicators pulsed across the map like infected wounds. The general explained that the barriers were collapsing faster than their projections predicted. They estimated 3 weeks before the Void Scourge broke through. Maybe 4 weeks if they were fortunate. But probably not 4 weeks. King Therivol looked older than he had when this all began. The weight of coming war had pressed years into his face. His forces were positioned at all the predicted breach points. But he knew what they faced. The Void Scourge did not conquer territory. They consumed everything and left only empty nothingness behind. No prisoners, no survivors, just void. Kaelin spoke with the authority she had learned from Claire. She said they could not allow the Scourge to establish any foothold in their realm. They had to hit the enemy at the breach points before the creatures could organize. Fast attacks with overwhelming force. Strike and fade and strike again. General Aldrich frowned. He said that traditional elven warfare doctrine emphasized defensive positions and magical barriers. They should fortify their strongholds and make the Scourge pay for every advance. Claire interrupted him. She explained that traditional doctrine assumed an enemy that wanted to hold territory. The Scourge did not care about land or resources. They were a consuming force that ate dimensions. You could not defend against that. You had to attack them at their weakest point, which was right when they were transitioning between dimensions. Elder Mistral was the most respected mage in the kingdom. She had studied dimensional physics for 3 centuries. She agreed with the humans' assessment. Their simulations showed that Scourge entities were most vulnerable in the moments immediately after breaching into a new reality. They needed time to fully phase into the dimension and stabilize their forms. Kaelin stood and the room fell silent. She outlined her plan. She would lead a rapid response force of 300 of their most mobile troops. They would use dragons and wyverns and the new glider craft the engineers had developed. Claire would command ground support forces. General Aldrich would handle the main army and defensive positions. King Therivol stood as well. He asked if Kaelin understood what she was proposing. She wanted to place herself at the primary breach point. If she fell there, the realm would lose its heir and its best warrior. Kaelin looked at her father with eyes that had seen too much combat for someone her age. She said if she fell, then she was never the warrior he needed her to be. He had brought Claire here to make her strong enough for this exact moment. He needed to trust that it had worked. The king studied his daughter. Then he looked at Claire. The human nodded once. She would pull Kaelin out herself if the situation became impossible, but she did not think that would be necessary. Therivol agreed to the plan, but he wanted multiple contingencies and extraction protocols ready. If things went wrong, he wanted options to save his daughter even if she refused to save herself. 3 weeks later, the Void Scourge arrived early. They always did. The dimensional barriers shattered at midnight across 12 locations simultaneously. Reality itself screamed as the fabric of space tore open. Creatures of living void poured through the wounds in existence. They were nightmares given form, constantly shifting masses of darkness and teeth and malevolent hunger that could not be satisfied. Kaelin was airborne within minutes. Ember's wings beat with thunderous power as they climbed toward the largest breach. Behind them, 300 riders followed in precise formation. Claire had insisted on communication devices like those used by human military forces. Now magical earpieces allowed instant coordination across the entire force. Kaelin's voice came through clearly giving orders. Alpha Wing would take the northern breach. Beta Wing was with her on the primary target. Mages were to provide suppression fire on anything larger than a building. Ground forces should establish kill zones at the predetermined coordinates. The first breach opened directly ahead of them. A spiral of absolute darkness that vomited forth wave after wave of scourge creatures. They came like a flood of living night. Their howls were sounds that should not exist in any sane reality. The noise alone caused some soldiers to falter. Kalen commanded Ember to dive. The dragon folded his wings and dropped like a stone gathering speed. At the last possible moment, he pulled up and released a torrent of flame across the emerging scourge forces. The creatures shrieked as fire disrupted their void forms. But there were so many of them. For every one that fell, 10 more pushed through the breach. Kalen whispered to herself, using the words Claire had drilled into her over thousands of training hours. Fear was just a reaction. Control the reaction and you controlled the outcome. She drew her sword. The blade was human-designed and forged from meteor metal that Claire had sourced from Earth. It cut through void creatures like they were made of smoke. The battle became chaos. Fire and magic and steel all mixed together in a desperate struggle. Kalen fought from Ember's back. Their movements were perfectly synchronized through their bond. She did not waste energy on flashy displays of power like traditional elven mages. Instead, she used precise strikes enhanced with just enough magic to disrupt the molecular structure of her targets. Every movement was efficient and deadly, exactly as Claire had taught her. On the ground, Claire commanded support forces with brutal effectiveness. She had taught them squad tactics developed by human military over centuries of warfare. How to create overlapping fields of fire. How to rotate exhausted units out of combat before they collapsed. Where elven commanders would have directed from safety, Claire was in the thick of fighting. Her rifle dropped scourge creatures with shots aimed at their core structures. Then something massive emerged from the primary breach. It towered over the battlefield, radiating cold that caused frost to spread across the ground in all directions. This was a devourer, one of the scourge's command creatures. Ancient and powerful and nearly impossible to kill. Claire's voice crackled through the communication device. She warned Kalen that the creature was too large for conventional assault. She was calling in artillery support. Kalen responded immediately. Negative. Artillery would hit their own forces. She was going in directly. Claire started to protest, but the princess had already committed. Ember banked hard and dove toward the massive devourer. This was the moment everything had been building toward. 3 years of training. 3 years of pushing past every limit. 3 years of refusing to be the fragile thing everyone expected. Kalen told Ember to give her maximum fire. The dragon roared and channeled every bit of flame he could produce. Kalen added her own magic to it, not trying to overpower the creature directly but targeting the dimensional breach still pulsing behind it. If she could collapse the breach, the devourer would be cut off from its power source. The combined assault struck like a hammer of pure energy. The breach wavered and began to destabilize. The devourer turned its full attention on Kalen. She felt the weight of its malevolence crash against her mind. This was where a weak person would break, where fear would overwhelm training and instinct would scream to flee. Instead, Kalen smiled. She said 2 words, "Not today." Then she drove her sword directly into the creature's core structure. The breach collapsed with a sound like reality breaking. The devourer exploded into dissipating void energy. Kalen and Ember emerged from the blast radius battered and burned but alive and victorious. Across the battlefield, the scourge forces faltered without their command presence. The elven armies pressed their advantage. By dawn, 11 of the 12 breaches had been sealed. The last one remained, but it was contained and weakening steadily. Claire found Kalen sitting against Ember's side. The princess was exhausted and covered in strange residue that scourge creatures left when they were destroyed. Her armor was scorched and dented. Blood ran from her nose where she had pushed her magic too hard. But she was smiling. Claire offered her a canteen and said the execution on that final maneuver had been solid. Not bad at all. The first month felt like dying slowly. Claire dragged Kalen from her comfortable bed every morning before the sun rose. She forced the princess into simple training clothes that felt rough against her sensitive skin. The silk robes and soft blankets were gone. Now there was only plain fabric and the cold morning air that made Kalen shiver. On the first day, Kalen tried to run as Claire instructed. She made it 50 steps before her stomach rebelled, and she vomited onto the training ground. Her legs shook and her vision blurred. She collapsed onto the dirt, gasping for air that would not come fast enough. The second day was worse. Kaylin managed 100 steps before her body gave up completely. She lay on the ground, unable to move, while Claire stood over her with arms crossed. The human did not offer sympathy or words of encouragement. She simply waited until Kaylin could stand again and then made her walk back to the palace. On the third morning, Kaylin did not even try to get out of bed. She pulled the blankets over her head and refused to move. Her entire body ached from muscles she did not know she possessed. Every movement brought fresh pain. She decided she would rather die in this bed than face another day of torture. Claire entered the room carrying a large bucket. She walked to the bedside without speaking. Then she dumped ice-cold water directly onto the princess and her expensive bedding. Kaylin screamed and jumped up, sputtering and shaking. Claire set the empty bucket down and looked at her with those cold, calculating eyes. She reminded Kaylin of what the princess had said in the throne room, that she wanted to stop being afraid. Claire explained in a flat voice that fear lived in comfort and died in effort. The choice was simple. Kaylin could stay in bed and wait for death to find her, or she could get up and fight for something better. But Claire would not coddle her or treat her like a fragile doll. Kaylin got up. The training was nothing like traditional elven warrior methods. Elven soldiers trained with grace and magic and elegant sword techniques passed down through generations. Claire taught dirty fighting and brutal efficiency. She showed Kaylin where to strike on an opponent to make them fall regardless of their size or strength. She explained that winning a fight was not about honor or beauty. It was about surviving when someone wanted you dead. The princess could not channel destructive magic without her nose bleeding and her head pounding like drums. Claire said that was fine. Magic was useful but not necessary. She taught Kaylin to use her small size as an advantage, to move in ways that made it impossible for larger enemies to hit her, to strike and fade and never stay still long enough to become a target. Physical conditioning was brutal and unending. Every morning they ran. Every afternoon they practiced combat movements until Kaylin collapsed. Every evening Claire made her stretch and work on balance and coordination. The princess vomited regularly. She cried when Claire was not watching. Her hands developed calluses and then blisters and then more calluses over the blisters. But slowly something changed. After 3 weeks, Kaylin realized she had run twice as far as that first day without vomiting. After 5 weeks, she could hold a training sword for an entire session without her arms shaking. Her body was adapting to demands that should have killed her. Claire never praised her. She simply made the training harder whenever Kaylin managed to complete something successfully. But sometimes late at night, when Kaylin was falling asleep exhausted, she would see something that might have been approval in the human's eyes. It vanished too quickly to be certain. The turning point came on a cold morning 6 weeks after training began. They were practicing in the old dragon caves beneath the palace. The vast cavern had been abandoned for centuries after the great dragons departed from Asterlin. Now it served as a private training ground where no one would watch the fragile princess fail. Kaylin was working on footwork drills. Claire had taught her to move in patterns that kept her constantly shifting position. Never planted, never predictable, always ready to dodge or strike or retreat, the princess was focused entirely on getting the steps correct. Left foot pivot, right foot slide. Turn and drop low, rise and step back. She did not notice the pillar until her foot caught on uneven stone. Kaylin stumbled and her momentum carried her directly toward a massive stone column. She was going to hit it hard. The impact would likely break bones that had been broken too many times already. Then fire bloomed in front of her face. A small burst of flame lit the darkness and showed her exactly where the pillar stood. Kaylin twisted at the last instant and caught herself against the stone instead of crashing into it. She stood there gasping and confused. Who had used magic? Claire had no magic. The cavern was supposed to be empty. Both women turned slowly toward the source of the flames. The small dragon sat on a rock ledge watching them with intelligent amber eyes. He was barely larger than a hunting dog. His scales shifted colors in the firelight from copper to gold and back again. His head tilted to one side as he studied them with an expression that seemed almost curious. Claire's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt. Dragons were supposed to be extinct in this realm. They had departed centuries ago when the magic began to fade. Yet here one sat watching them like he had been waiting for this exact moment. Kaylin took a step forward. She felt something stir deep in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the dragon's fire. It was a connection she could not name or explain. The dragon did not run or attack. Instead, he lowered his head in what looked like a bow of respect. The princess walked closer until she stood directly in front of the creature. She reached out one trembling hand. The dragon pressed his snout gently against her palm. Heat flooded through her body. Not painful but powerful and certain. She felt his emotions as clearly as her own. Curiosity about these strange beings who trained in his home. Loyalty to something he recognized in her. A fierce protectiveness that made her throat tighten. Claire watched the bonding with professional interest. She knew from her briefings about elven culture that dragons bonded for life with a single rider. The bond was unbreakable and gave both dragon and rider access to powers neither possessed alone. If this creature was choosing Kaelin, that changed everything about their training. Kaelin looked at the dragon and said she would call him Ember. The dragon's eyes brightened with approval. He made a sound between a purr and a chirp that vibrated through her bones. Claire cleared her throat. She said that was good. Dragons were force multipliers in combat. They would incorporate Ember into training starting tomorrow. But tonight Kaelin still had to finish her cool-down exercises. Kaelin groaned, but she was smiling. For the first time since the human arrived, she felt something other than exhaustion and fear. She felt hope and possibility and the beginning of strength. Training intensified with Ember's presence. The young dragon grew rapidly as if feeding on Kaelin's determination. Within 2 months, he was the size of a horse and strong enough to carry his rider through the air. Claire adapted their combat drills immediately. She taught Kaelin how to fight from dragonback, how to use aerial advantage, how to coordinate attack so that rider and dragon moved as one unified weapon. The court began to notice changes in their princess. She no longer fainted at formal dinners or needed servants to help her walk. Her body remained slender, but now it was built from lean muscle and tempered bone. Every movement carried purpose and control. Her wild magic had been channeled through her bond with Ember into something focused and deadly. 1 year into training, Claire decided it was time to test Kaelin outside the safety of the palace. She took the princess to the borderlands where reality grew thin. Sometimes creatures from other dimensions slipped through weak points in the barriers. It was dangerous territory that most elves avoided. They encountered a pack of void-touched wolves. 6 of them, each one corrupted by exposure to the void scourge. Their eyes glowed with sick purple light and their bodies moved in ways that defied natural physics. These were creatures that could kill experienced warriors. Claire hung back with her hand on her weapon. She was ready to intervene if necessary, but she wanted to see what Kaelin could do when actual death was the price of failure. She did not need to intervene. Kaelin moved like flowing water. Ember's flames drove the wolves into positions where the princess could strike with maximum efficiency. She used every technique Claire had drilled into her over thousands of hours. Strike the joints. Target the eyes. Never stop moving. Fight smart, not hard. The bond with Ember let them anticipate each other's actions perfectly. When the last wolf fell, Kaelin stood among the bodies. Her breathing was steady and controlled. Her blade was clean because she had already wiped it on one of the corpses. Her eyes held something Claire recognized from every warrior she had ever trained. Not cruelty or pleasure in killing. Just purpose and the calm that came from knowing you could survive terrible things. Claire said one word. Good. Then she said Kaelin was ready for phase 2. The princess turned with surprise on her face. She asked what phase 2 meant. Claire explained that building Kaelin into something that would not break had been phase 1. Now they would turn her into something that... The elven kingdom of Asterlin floated between worlds like a crystal dream, hanging in the darkness of space. King Theraval stood at the highest point of his palace and watched red storms gathering at the edges of reality itself. Something terrible was coming toward his realm, and his people were not ready to face it. His daughter, Princess Kaelin, sat in her chambers below, wrapped in soft silk blankets. She had been born with silver hair, which the old prophecies said marked her as someone special, but her body was weak and fragile. Even morning sunlight caused her pain. Her bones broke easily, and her magic was wild and impossible to control. The court whispered behind closed doors that she would never live long enough to wear the crown. They said she could never defend the realm from the darkness that approached. The king had tried everything his world could offer. Healers came from every corner of the kingdom, but none could help her. His generals looked at the frail princess and shook their heads. They said she was a lost cause and the kingdom needed a strong warrior, not a sick girl. But Tharivel refused to accept defeat. Deep in the forbidden libraries, he found ancient records that spoke of a species called humans. They came from a small planet named Earth, far away in a forgotten corner of space. The record said humans were strange creatures. They had no magic and their technology was primitive compared to elven science. They lived such short lives that they barely had time to learn anything of value. But they possessed something the elves had lost long ago in their quest for perfection. Humans had determination and adaptability, and a stubborn refusal to accept the impossible. When everything said they should give up and die, they somehow found a way to survive and keep fighting. King Tharivel spent a fortune opening channels to Earth. He traded royal treasures that had been collected over thousands of years. Finally, he purchased the services of a human, not a warrior or a scholar, but someone the human military called a combat medic and survival instructor. Her name was Claire Hayes. When Claire stepped through the portal into the grand throne room, she looked completely unimpressed by the magnificent hall around her. She stood average height for her species with dark brown hair pulled back in a practical style. Her skin was olive-colored and marked with various scars that told stories of past battles. Her eyes moved constantly, assessing everything with the cold calculation of someone who had survived terrible things. She wore what humans called fatigues and carried a pack on her back that looked half her own size. Claire looked directly at the king without bowing or showing any of the formal respect the elven court expected. She asked if he was the king and if the small figure beside him was the princess who needed help. Her tone was flat and businesslike, as if she was discussing a simple transaction rather than speaking to royalty. Kaylin sat on a smaller throne next to her father. Protective silk wrappings covered most of her body, because even the air in the throne room sometimes hurt her skin. She stared at the human with wide violet eyes. The woman seemed so solid and real and unafraid. Everything Kaylin was not. King Tharivel explained carefully that his daughter needed training. In 3 years, a terrible force called the Void Scourge would break through the barriers that protected their dimension. His armies were preparing for war, but according to prophecy, Kaylin had to lead them. The problem was simple and terrible. She could not even hold a sword without collapsing from exhaustion. Claire walked forward, ignoring the shocked gasps from the assembled nobles at her lack of proper manners. She studied Kaylin the way a mechanic might study a broken machine. Then she asked a question that made everyone in the room freeze. She asked if Kaylin could not do these things or if she simply had never learned how. A court physician stepped forward, sputtering that the princess had a medical condition that made her fragile. But Claire cut him off with 2 cold words. She said she had not asked him. Then she crouched down in front of Kaylin so their eyes were at the same level. She asked what the princess wanted. Not what her father wanted or what the court expected, but what Kaylin herself truly desired. No one had ever asked Kaylin that question before. She hesitated, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely louder than a whisper. She said she wanted to not be afraid anymore. Claire nodded once as if that answer made perfect sense. She told the king she would need a training ground and access to the royal forges. She also said everyone needed to stay out of her way because she had 3 years to turn the princess into something that could survive. She did not have time to deal with court politics or people telling her what could not be done. Deep beneath the palace in the abandoned dragon caves, something stirred in the darkness. A small creature no larger than a house cat opened amber eyes that glowed softly in the shadows. Its scales shifted between copper and gold, catching light that did not exist in the dark cavern. The creature had been waiting for a very long time, as dragons measure such things, waiting for the one who would need it most. As evening fell, Claire and Kaylin walked down from the throne room toward the training grounds. The human did not speak, and the princess did not know what to say. In the shadows behind them, the small dragon followed on silent feet. It could smell something in the air that made its ancient instincts stir, the scent of destiny beginning to unfold in the sharp tang of defiance against fate itself. King Tharivel watched them leave from his high window. He wondered if he had just saved his daughter or condemned her to something worse than her illness. But he had run out of choices. The red storms were growing stronger at the edges of reality. The Void Scourge was coming, and it would devour everything in its path. His realm needed a warrior to lead them. His daughter needed to become that warrior or die trying. The human Claire Hayes had a reputation across certain parts of Earth. She had served in conflicts that broke other soldiers. She had trained elite forces and survived situations that killed everyone around her. She did not accept failure, and she did not believe in the word impossible. If anyone could forge a fragile elven princess into a weapon strong enough to face the coming darkness, it was her. But even Claire had doubts as she looked at the thin girl walking beside her. Kaylin moved carefully as if every step might shatter her bones. Her breathing was labored from just walking downstairs. 3 years seemed like such a short time to transform someone so broken into a warrior, capable of leading armies. Claire pushed those doubts aside. Doubt was useless. She had a job to do, and she would do it or die trying. That was the human way. You did not waste time wondering if something was possible. You simply started working and figured out the problems as they appeared. They reached the old training yard as the last light faded from the sky. Claire dropped her pack and started pulling out equipment. She told Kaylin to get some sleep because tomorrow morning they would begin. The princess asked nervously what they would start with. Would it be sword practice or magic training or military strategy? Claire looked at her and said they would start with the basics. Learning how to fall down without breaking, learning how to stand up after falling, learning that pain was just a signal from the body and signals could be managed. Then maybe after a few months they could think about weapons. Kaylin felt something crack inside her chest. Not her fragile bones, but something deeper. A wall she had built around herself made of fear and resignation and acceptance of her own weakness. This human woman spoke about her learning to fight, as if it was simply a matter of time and effort. As if being weak was a temporary condition rather than her permanent fate. That night, Kaylin lay in her silk bed and could not sleep. She thought about the human and the cold confidence in her voice. She thought about the question no one else had asked. What did she want? Not what was expected of her or what destiny demanded, but what she herself truly desired. The answer came to her in the darkness. She wanted to be strong. Not just physically strong, but strong enough to face the terrible things coming toward her world without breaking. Strong enough to protect the people who depended on her. Strong enough to look at fear and choose to move forward anyway. In the dragon caves below, the small creature curled up to sleep. Tomorrow it would reveal itself. Tomorrow, the bond that had been written in prophecy long before any of them were born would finally begin. A fragile princess and her dragon. A human teacher who refused to accept defeat. 3 beings brought together by fate and necessity to face an enemy that consumed entire dimensions. The void scourge was coming, but so was something it had never encountered before. The stubborn determination of humanity combined with elven magic and the ancient power of dragons. An alliance that should not work but somehow would. King Tharivol finally slept that night, though his dreams were troubled. He dreamed of his daughter standing on a battlefield wreathed in flames. He could not tell if she was burning or if she had become the fire itself. When he woke before dawn, he did not know if the dream had been a warning or a promise. 3 years. That was all the time they had. 3 years to transform impossible hope into reality. 3 years to turn a dying princess into a warrior strong enough to save not just one kingdom, but perhaps all of dimensional space itself. The training would begin at dawn, and nothing in Asterlin would ever be the same again.